let's have a quick look at food chains and food webs. Now, a food chain is a way to show how different organisms depend on each other for food. So here we have 3 different organisms. We're looking at grass, sheep, and the wolf. So what we say is that the grass gets eaten by the sheep. So far so good, but then it's a bad day for the sheep because the sheep gets eaten by the wolf. Okay, this is a very simple food chain. Now, when writing this out, we would start with the grass. Okay, grass gets eaten by the sheep. Now, the direction of the arrow is important. Okay, now the sheep gets eaten by the wolf. Some people make a mistake in that they put the arrow going this way, i.e. backwards, because the sheep eats the grass and the wolf eats the sheep. That's actually not the way the arrow goes. It needs to go the other way. And the reason for this is we're actually not saying with the food chain what eats what, although we can read it as that. We can quite happily look at this food chain and say, oh yeah, the sheep eats the grass, but the sheep got eaten by the wolf. But we're not really showing that. What we're actually looking at is the transfer of energy. Okay, so food chains actually show transfer of, and I'll just shorthand, energy, right? Energy. So the energy moves from the grass into the sheep, and then the energy moves from the sheep into the wolf. So we're looking at the flow of energy through the system. Okay, so that is one example of a food chain, a very straightforward, basic example of a food chain. And remember, the direction of the arrows goes from the food to the feeder, right? From what gets eaten into what does the eating. Okay, cool. Now, the grass, let's look at the grass. The grass is a producer, okay, because it produces its own food. So let's label it a producer. Now, in producing its own food, it also is referred to as being an autotroph. Let's break apart this word. The great thing about science is that you can often break apart words to figure out what they're talking about. So auto means self, and troph means to do with food or feeding. So an autotroph makes its own food. Okay, the plants are autotrophs. They produce their own food through the process of photosynthesis. Let's actually throw that one down there just to show that we can break the words apart to see what they are talking about. So photosynthesis, what is this all about? Well, photo is to do with light. Synthesis means to make. So plants use photosynthesis. They use the light energy to make something. What are they making? Well, they're making their own food, right? So that's what makes them an autotroph. They make their own food through the process of photosynthesis, using light to make their own food. Okay, great. Now, that was the grass. It's a producer. It's also called an autotroph. The sheep, on the other hand, cannot make its own food. It is not an autotroph. The sheep eats the plants, so it's called a herbivore. Herbivores are plant eaters. So the sheep is a herbivore. The wolf, on the other hand, is a carnivore. It's not eating a plant, it's eating meat. So the wolf is a carnivore. Now, both the sheep and the wolf together, well, neither of them are producing their own food. They have to consume something else. So whereas the grass was a producer, plants are producers, after the producer we have consumers. So the sheep and the wolf are both referred to as being consumer. Now, just like the producer had another name, it was autotroph, well, consumers have another name. They are also referred to as heterotrophs. Heterotroph. Now, we know what troph means, to do with food or feeding level. Hetero means different or other. So heterotroph can't make its own food. It's not an autotroph. It has to eat something else. It has to eat a different organism. Okay, so heterotroph. Now, there could be actually more levels in the food chain, right? So when we had our sheep, that was our herbivore, and then we had the wolf was a carnivore, but there might be more carnivores later on down the track. Or if we were talking about both of them as being consumers, well, look, the sheep's a consumer and the wolf is a consumer, but which one comes first? So we would differentiate by calling primary, secondary, tertiary, and that's just the shorthand for writing it, and quaternary, etc. Right? So if there's more than one carnivore or more than one consumer, we go with primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary, etc. Alright, so let's take a quick look at another food chain. This is a marine food chain in this case. We have phytoplankton in the middle here. Right, so we're starting in the middle, we're going clockwise. This is phytoplankton. Now phytoplankton are tiny little plants in the ocean. Let's just write plankton, teeny tiny little organisms. Generally you can think of them as being microscopic, so they're really, really little. Now phytoplankton are the tiny little plants. Okay, so tiny little plants in the ocean, and the tiny little animals to the left of that, this is actually called zooplankton. Now I know it looks like zooplankton, but you wouldn't say that, would you? No, you would say zooplankton. So we've got phytoplankton, the producers in this case, and so we can draw an arrow here going into the next level. Now this is the zooplankton, is our herbivore. It's eating the plant, so it's the herbivore, and that gets eaten by the fish up here. So they would be a carnivore, because it's not eating plants, it's eating the meat, it's eating the herbivore, so that's a carnivore. But the fish are eaten by a seal, that is also a carnivore, and the seal might get eaten by a white shark, which is also a carnivore. So remember, we would say, okay, we have our phytoplankton as the producer, the zooplankton is the herbivore, the fish would be the primary carnivore, the seal the secondary carnivore, and the white shark would be a tertiary carnivore. Okay, so that's using the carnivore herbivore terminology, or we could say that the phytoplankton, this is the producer. So you're a producer, and then the others could all be labeled consumers. Okay, so the zooplankton would be the primary consumer, the fish would be the secondary consumer, the seal would be the tertiary consumer, and the white shark would be the quaternary consumer. Okay, now we actually have yet another way to talk about the organisms. We could talk about the food level that they are sitting in the food chain. So if we're starting with the producers, well, that's the first food level, isn't it? And what's a good way to say to do with food or feeding? Troph, right? So we're talking trophic level. So we would say that the producers are lying at the first, what we call trophic level, which makes the zooplankton the second trophic level. Then we have the third trophic level. The seal is the fourth trophic level, and the white shark is the fifth trophic level. So there are different ways to talk about the organisms, right? We could go producer, herbivore, and then primary, secondary, tertiary carnivores, or we can go producer and then all the consumers, primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary, etc. Or we could just say, hey, you know what, first trophic level, or second trophic level, or seventh trophic level, depending on how long the food chain is. So there are different ways to talk about the different organisms. Now, another thing is that actually some organisms' position in the food chain can vary as their diet differs, right? So let's have an example of a bear. Now, the upper left photo, we've got a bear eating berries. Well, the berry is a producer, right? It's the plant, which makes the bear a herbivore. It's eating the plant. But on the right, the bear's eating a salmon, which makes it a carnivore. Okay, so we've got a bear being a herbivore and a bear being a carnivore. In terms of consumers, well, both bears in these photos are consumers, but the bear eating the salmon could be much further down the track, right? So when the bear eats the berries, it's a primary consumer, but when it eats the salmon, it's actually functioning as a quaternary consumer. Now, what's going on here? Well, the salmon are tertiary consumers because they eat herring, but the herring are secondary consumers because they eat zooplankton, which are of course primary consumers because they eat the phytoplankton. Now, I'm just actually should point out these arrows are backwards in terms of a food chain, right? I'm just showing, why is that salmon a tertiary consumer? Because it ate the herring, which ate the zooplankton, which ate the phytoplankton. If we were listing the organisms as part of a food chain, we would of course put the arrows in this direction, and then I guess we need another one from the salmon into the bear. So there we go, arrows in the correct direction if we're talking food chain wise. So anyway, that's just showing that depending on what an organism is eating from day to day, whether it's eating berries or salmon, its position in the food chain can change. Now, here we have an example of, again, it's a marine food chain, but actually it's more than one food chain, isn't it? This is a food web. Okay, so this is the difference between a food chain and a food web. A chain really just shows sort of one progression of the energy through the system, right? Like in this case, we're going from the grass to the sheep to the wolf. That's how the energy is moved along. But in this case, well, let's see, we start with our phytoplankton, right? That's our producer. Now we could go up to the baleen whale and then that could get eaten by an orca, right? So there we go, a very small, short food chain from phytoplankton to baleen whale to orca. Or maybe we go from phytoplankton to herring, and then that might go to salmon and then to the orca. Or maybe the phytoplankton the energy goes to the zooplankton because the zooplankton ate the phytoplankton, and then the zooplankton get eaten by the baleen whale, which then goes to the orca. Or maybe from the herring to the seal, and then the seal got eaten by the orca, etc. So what we actually have here are a number of different food chains, but they're all interlinked. Right, so that's what a food web is, essentially. It's just lots and lots of different food chains that sort of crisscross and are all linked in together. So there we go. There's your food chain and food web.
Don't forget to hit the like button. Yeah, and subscribe to It's Up Here. And here's another video.